Hi, folks. This is Alan Story speaking to you on the Left Lane Presents. And our video today is all about the United States elections, the victory of Trump, what it all means. Here comes another person. Sorry. Whoa, all right. Um, and So we have three guests here coming to us from the Ukraine, Howie Hawkins, who ran as the U.S. presidential candidate of the Green Party in 2020. Below him on my screen is Matt Huber, who's from the same city in New York, Syracuse, who is an environmental professor, activist, very interested in climate change, all these important questions. And the third guest is Matt Callahan, who's coming to us from the United States. He was born in San Francisco, but he now lives in Bern, Switzerland, and is a real follower of the U.S. political scene. And then as well is my good friends across here from the left lane. I won't introduce all of them. So we're here to talk about what happened 2 days ago in part of a much bigger trend. I was reading today an article called The Politics of Cultural Despair that was actually sent to me by John, and when I subscribe as well, by the American journalist Chris Hedges, one of the best around. And Chris has talked about how this election was about the politics of cultural despair, the despair about the number of layoffs, the job situation, inflation, a failed society, and that people discourse so despairing that a cult leader, that being Trump, was able to put himself forward, and people bought it, and people have bought it big time. It was quite a major victory for Trump, a coming back to power for the second time. So let's go. Everybody's ready. And I'll ask my first question, and then my colleagues here will jump in and ask other ones. So Howie, Matt, let's start with the election result itself. We don't want to sort of spend the next hour on all of that. But so why did Trump win, Howie, and why did Harris lose? Over to you.
I think Harris didn't give people a reason to vote for her. In fact, she got a lot less votes than Biden got last time. Trump got about the same number. So the question is, why didn't the Democratic base come out for Kamala Harris? And I think the answer is, when you think of Kamala Harris, what she stand for. And in the interviews and the surveys, people were saying, we don't know what she stands for. You think of Donald Trump, what does he stand for? We're going to deport all the immigrants. We're going to build a wall. He's anti-immigrant. These people know what he stands for. And people who have resentments and they want to get back at people, and we have a long history of racism in this country, he's somebody they vote for. And then the people who are, if they have cultural despair or economic despair, what they do know, and this is in the middle of the political spectrum, people who are thinking which way to go, the Democrats didn't give them a reason, so they're upset with the Democrats, who for decades have not delivered on basic economic needs. So they're going to give the other guy a chance. And some of that is Trump sells himself as a strong authority, a strong figure. Those of us that live in New York know he's a con man. At least most of us do or should. But that's who he is. But he pulled one over, and I think a lot of the people that voted for him in hopes that he's going to control inflation and bring back jobs are going to be very disappointed. And the chaos he's going to bring, like trying to deport 12 to 20 million people, weaponize the justice system to get back at his enemies, and all this, all these tariffs. He says he's going to control inflation and slap on these big tariffs, which is not going to happen. It'll do the opposite. I think a lot of people are going to be disappointed. But I think the bottom line is Kamala Harris didn't give the base of the Democratic Party a reason to vote for her.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Howie. Matt Huber, jump for it.
Yeah, I mean, poll after poll after poll showed the number one issue for voters was the economy and inflation. I mean, we had the first inflation in several decades, and it really hammered the working class in a really significant way. And um, it was unfortunate that the inflation kicked off right in the beginning of the Biden administration, and they didn't really ever have an answer for it, really. I mean, they had lofty ideas of industrial policy and trying to channel investments for climate change, but really no answer for inflation, which has lessened. But now the sort of the writing's on the wall for most working people. I mean, the grocery prices are so high, and so people were angry about that, and people are generally angry toward politics and the status quo and the establishment. And the Kamala Harris campaign, I mean, her campaign was, as Howie said, like it wasn't really clear what it stood for. Economically, it was really the sort of like retread of very vague messaging, like from the Obama and Clinton times, like talking about an opportunity economy and talking about like giving incentives to homeowners and entrepreneurs. I mean, it had no answer for the real pain that people were feeling. And so people are angry. And if you look at the two candidates, I mean, there's one that's clearly hated by the establishment, by the elite. And there's another one that's her whole message is about protecting the democracy and sort of protecting the kind of norms and institutions and the status quo. So I think everyone who's been suffering in this economy sort of wanted to vote against the establishment, and so it's very obvious who you would vote for in that situation. So yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately, as they said back in the Clinton times, it's the economy, stupid, and the Harris campaign really had no answer for that.
Okay, and Matt Callahan, what do you think? Why was it? What happened in this result?
Well, just a couple of examples from my direct experience here in the States. On Friday, I played a benefit for the people of East Palestine. Mm-hmm. People may have heard of that. It's ironic because the other reason the Democratic Party lost was Palestine. Mm-hmm. So the combination of East Palestine and Palestine probably answers the question, because East Palestine is where the trains derailed in February 2023, releasing clouds of toxic chemicals and so on and so forth, literally making the entire population sick. Many of them are dying. And at this benefit for them, trying to raise awareness, raise money, it became evident that all of them were voting for Trump. So the reason they were voting for Trump had nothing to do with liking Trump. Actually, many of them hate Trump, but they hate the Democrats worse, because the Democrats are the traitors to the working class. They're the ones who supposedly represent the working class. They don't. I never believed the Democrats represented the working class at all, but people do believe that. And so from the point of view of East Palestine, there was no question of supporting these people who had essentially abandoned them and left them to die, literally. That, I think, is symbolic on one level, but it's also actually factually representative, because there are vast numbers of people in the United States who have been destroyed. And this is completely, that didn't even enter into the politics of this election. There are literally tens of millions of working people of all ethnicities who are living miserable lives as a result of the capitalist system. And that capitalist system has been represented by the Democratic Party. So this is how I see it. The other side of it is Palestine, meaning that there is no way that you can get away with genocide. And so there's a punishment of the Democrats for prosecuting this genocidal war. So that to me is very clear. And I don't think that there's really I don't think there are any arguments that can be leveled against that. It's simply so clear. What the other side of the question, though, of course, as Howie mentioned, is what does that mean about Trump? I think it will be very quickly evident that Trump will be terrible for the working class, and he will make the working class pay even more So it's not a question of Trump as some sort of victory. The question really to me is not how or why Trump won, but it's how and why the Democratic Party lost. And the defeat of the Democratic Party um, entails some opportunities, not the Trump victory, but the defeat of the Democratic Party and this whole liberal lie and propaganda machine, the politics of joy. What joy? What are you talking about? This is Hollywood. This is the kind of propagandistic message which is so loaded with nonsense and whatever. People just aren't buying it anymore. So there's an opportunity for people to learn something about how their consciousness is being shaped and manipulated by propaganda and so on and so forth. And of course, the job now is to organize, organize and fight back. That's the only answer.
We're going to get to that. Let's just go. May I ask my second question? People are saying that Trump is a fascist and that the United States is on the cusp of fascism. That we all know that he's obviously got authoritarian, repressive instincts, etc. But is the United States, tell us, from there on the ground, is it on the cusp of turning into a fascist America? Howie?
I think Trump is a fascist in terms of, the policies and the way he wants to govern. I think about a third of the country wants that. And that's the old Dixiecrat, racist legacy of slavery and dispossessing North America from the Indians. That cohort, I think, has been shrinking. Ironically, now we got Trump, but think back to 1968. Nixon was running a dog whistle racist campaign, and George Wallace was running an explicitly racist campaign, and their combined vote total was 61%. The hardcore for Trump is about 35%, and the other 15%, I would say, are people that were mad, like we're talking about. They mad about, the Democrats abandoning the working class and not taking care of people. And then there's the country club Republicans that just want the tax cuts that Trump promises. So that's how he gets up to over 50% this time. But I think most people, the majority of Americans, don't want that kind of authoritarian, repressive system of fascism. And I'm hoping that as Trump begins to implement his program, there's going to be rebellion and resistance. So, the mass base for fascism, I think the key question is, are the other people that don't like it going to take it and be passive, or are they going to fight back and resist and protest? And I think we don't know yet.
Okay. So, Matt, what do you think? Are we on the cusp of fascism?
I think I take a more narrow view of what fascism is. First of all, typically, fascism doesn't typically come to power through a victory in the popular vote, which, shows that not that I think, as others have said, not that everyone loves Trump, but he won a decisive victory democratically in this election. So, the other thing, again, I take a very narrow view. I see fascism as a historical kind of product of the interwar period, characterized by the preparation for total war and also basically trying to defeat a very well organized and powerful socialist left, which I think neither of those two conditions really characterize today. That said, as Howie said, he has very authoritarian tendencies, and that's very concerning. I mean, but if we were on the brink of a fascist takeover, I'm in London right now, I probably would stay here. But I'm actually planning on coming back on Monday because, if we were in a fascist state, I think people like me who are vocally espousing a socialist or Marxist point of view would be, rounded up and put in jail. I don't think that's happening yet. Maybe I'm naive, but I do think there's a lot of concerning things about his authoritarian tendencies, his and so forth. And obviously as Howie said, what he wants to do vulnerable populations like undocumented immigrants is extremely concerning. And I think, like Howie said, we have to start to figure out how we're going to organize to defend these populations that are going to be attacked by the Trump regime.
Okay, Matt Callahan, you're in the United States. Are you going to be coming home on the next jet to Switzerland? I mean, the point in the article I was reading was that, in fact, there is not, unfortunately, a well-organized left in the United States. That, that all the capitalists are not saying, oh God, there's going to be a takeover by the working class in the United States by Monday or something. That's just not true. It's not true in the United Kingdom either. Matt, what do you think? Is fascism right sort of on the edge there?
Well, I think the question of definitions is one thing, and I'd rather not take up the limited time we have getting into a definition battle. But the point is, there's increased surveillance, there's increased policing, there's increased authoritarianism. There are more and more people at risk of being imprisoned or silenced or whatever. This is a general tendency in the West, and it's not going to get any better. It's clearly going to increase. What happened to Julian Assange is going to happen to a lot more journalists and so on and so forth. It's already been happening. And the illusion that somehow fascism is some great departure from our wonderful liberal democracy that's a delusion. You have to be deluded to think that America is a democracy in the first place. It has never been a democracy, and it never will be a democracy until there's an actual revolution that puts the working class in power. If you have a workers' republic, then you might have democracy. So let's get real about what's actually at stake. Fascism arises to suppress the working class. When they're afraid that workers are going to actually organize and rebel, then they bring in the authoritarians and whatever and that's what's happening right now. And that's not only happening in America, it's happening in the rest of the world. It's happening in Europe. Europe is facing exactly the same situations, and for all the same reasons. The only different thing in Europe is the fact that Europe has become a vassal of the United States. Its liberal leadership has made it subservient to the United States. So going back to Europe to answer your question doesn't really change anything for me. I mean, either place, I'm at the mercy, if you want to say, of a liberal democratic regime which could take away my rights any minute. And it will do that. It will do that. So if you're worried about that, then shut up, But if you're worried about the world going to hell, then you have to speak up. So those are the choices.
Okay. So there's somebody's microphone is bringing in too many people. So if you're not speaking, can you just mute yourself so we don't have background noise? Is any of the panel here ready to ask a question? Okay, John Tooman, coming to us from near Manchester.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Thanks to three comrades from the States as well. Couple of things that I agree totally about fascism, and I could add loads more, but I won't derail the meeting on that. But basically, I think that every advanced capitalist state has developed its coercive powers against its own people beyond, way beyond what was possible in the interwar period. And they are very happy with that. They do not need to take the political risk of going with a fascist party or a fascist leader. Trump's policies are absolutely horrible. Second thing is, my question really is that I read today about an article about incumbent governments losing all over the Western world, not just the Western world either, because capitalism is in a multifaceted crisis. And it seems to me as if governments come in, they have weird plans for manipulating consent, yes, but also in Starmer's case in Britain, growing the economy. In Trump's case, protecting American industry against the world, high tariff barriers, etc. This isn't going to work either. Basically, since the credit crunch, what is it, nearly 20 years ago now, they haven't had a plan. They haven't had a global capitalist plan anymore. They've lost their mojo. They do not know how the next round of capitalist accumulation is going to happen. And it ain't going to happen. And so these governments will continue failing, failing, failing. And
Okay,
so
John, I'm just
I'd
going
like
to
to
cut you.
see us go on to discussing what this means for America, what it means for the world, and what we can do about it.
Okay, why don't our guests say, what can we do in the United States? Should we get behind the Democratic Party so that in 2028, when maybe J.D. Vance will be running as Republican president, is sort of lining up behind? And this is what's a question: Matt or Howie, join the Democratic Party? Get what to do about all of this?
Well, I would say absolutely not. That's been the problem since the Popular Front, the communists instituted in 1936, that drew the whole labor movement and most of the progressive left into the Democratic Party. The Socialist Party stayed independent till the 50s, and then they did the same thing. So the left, as an independent socialist alternative, its own identity, its own analysis, its own program, has largely disappeared from American politics. So we have people militant, they go out on the street, they protest, they'll do civil disobedience, but they're not anti-capitalist. They're not about changing the system. And when elections come around, they get behind, somebody like Kamala Harris. And they're detached, from the real needs of the working class, which means we need a party of the left, which
Okay,
can present an alternative and fight the fascists. And I would call them fascists. We can get into that argument again, but fight them better than the Democrats. So the Democrats normalized the far right in America by adapting to them, like on the immigration question.
okay.
And treating, let me just add this point. Biden was going through his whole term saying we need bipartisanship. Bipartisanship was the party that tried to overthrow his election. That is not a formula for fighting the far right.
Right.
We need an independent left.
Matt Huber, what's your idea of what's the next steps for progressives in the United States, as there may be all kinds of battles ahead?
I've been most inspired by the little green shoots of the revival of the labor movement that we've seen, like in the UAW and the Teamsters and other unions. And so my hope is that really rebuilding labor and rebuilding the power of workers to strike and to cause crises in society, that activity could leak out into the formation of an alternative party or labor-oriented working class political formation that could actually be a real force in American politics. We're stuck, as Howie knows, with this duopoly and the two-party system that is both of them captured by the capitalist class. And our country's never really had a labor party or a working class party. And I think now's this utter defeat of the Democrats at least provides an opening for maybe thinking that. And I think it has to be based on the kind of militancy we're seeing in the labor movement already.
Just give us an example. We don't follow this, line by line here in Britain. Like, what did the UAW do recently that's important?
Well, they started, some activists in the UAW started what's called a reform caucus. And what they wanted to do was that the UAW was this, typical kind of corrupt and bureaucratic union that didn't even have democratic elections for their leadership. And their campaign was for one member, one vote. They wanted all their members to be able to vote for the leadership, and they were able to change the rules of how elections take place. And then when they had elections, they were able to elect one of their people in the Reform Caucus to leadership, and he's called Sean Fain, and he became the president of the UAW. And then, of course, they were right on the precipice of a contract negotiation, and he was able to organize this really innovative and interesting strike that he called a stand-up strike in relation to the sit-down strike that the Flint auto workers did in the 1930s. And they really strategically pinpointed particular factories, particular supply chain nodes in the big three automakers. And they were able to level really significant cost on these firms. At one point, the Financial Times showed that General Motors had lost $800 million because of this strike. And then they, of course, won a record contract. They were able to really inspire a lot of their members. And then they went down south in last spring and won a union election in Chattanooga, Tennessee for the first time in the U.S. South. So that's the kind of thing, like fighting, winning, striking, building confidence amongst working class people. That to me is like the stuff we need to cultivate on a much wider scale. And that's the kind of thing I think could lead to the formation of more durable political organizations like a party, as opposed to these unions, which are in the economic realm. So.
Matt Callahan, go for it.
Yeah, I would just add to those comments that I think that there are two things that would sort of encapsulate what I hope will happen. One is moving away from protest politics to resistance politics, organizing strikes, boycotts, occupations that actually do damage to the capitalist class, and not going out in the street demonstrating as if you can get a reform out of a politician. That's over for me. That's finished. It's not going to work. More and more working people are going to see that, and they want to do damage to the enemy. They want the class enemy to suffer, and that's the key. That's the key, is that you want to actually do something that will bring about damage to the capitalist class and to the capitalist system. If that is the guiding principle of workers, then they're going to force their unions to abandon this whole business unionism thing that's been dominating for 75 years, and they'll start taking control of their organizations to actually inflict damage on the class enemy. The other thing is that on the level of grassroots community organizing and the relationship between churches, or various religious entities, with educational entities, with food banks, and all these other places where working class people are congregated and are actually meeting to survive. In those situations, you have the potential to politicize and to educate and to bring people together to take matters into their own hands. That's the key. It's not about elections, man, and it never was in the United States. All change that's taken place in the United States has been through mass movements, revolutionary struggle, and then the elections reflect that. That's the history of the country, and we've got to be teaching the history of the country if you want people to understand the future of the country.
Okay, great. Now, somehow I don't think we see this kind of stuff in The Guardian or on the BBC talking about the Trump election. Okay, Holly, go for it.
Hi, thanks everyone. I saw Harris's campaign essentially say that if the people that voted for Jill Stein had voted for her, then she would have won. How true do you think this statement is?
Okay, and they got Jill Stein got about 600. Last statistics I saw, 640,000 votes. Howie, if she had, is she the difference between Harris and Trump?
No, it's simple math. She was not. She was not the margin of difference. And,
right.
I would say one thing we can change in this country, and we were making good progress until this election, where we didn't win some ballot initiatives that would have created ranked choice voting, which gets rid of the spoiler problem and would enable the left, at least in the first round, to get a true measure of, how many people really support it. Right. And if we add that in the form of multi-member districts for legislatures, what's known as the single transferable vote in like Ireland, then you would have the Greens or other leftists in legislatures, and then they'd have some leverage. Right now, they don't have leverage. But I would push back on the idea that nothing has come out of electoral politics. The fact is, we did have mass independent parties of the left, and they were agrarian kind of socialism going back to the 1830s, the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, and then after the Civil War, the Farmer Labor Populist parties, the Greenback Labor Party, the People's Party, and that went into the Socialist Party in the first third of the 20th century. They put issues on the table, and they elected a lot of people to Congress and to state legislatures in many cities, and they put the slavery issue onto the table before the Civil War. They put dealing with corporate power, monopolies, and public utilities on the table after the Civil War. And the socialists, the sewer socialists were providing public services and publicly owned utilities for the first 30 years and posing an alternative. They didn't take the presidency, they didn't take a majority in Congress, but they did put issues on the table that then the whole political system had to respond to. So I would argue that whether it's labor action, strike action, protests, without an independent party, then the more liberal of the two parties, which is the Democrats, is going to take those protests for granted. They're going to say, oh, yeah, we're with you. But when it comes to actually doing something, they're not going to do it.
Okay, Matt Callahan, why don't you respond to that?
Well, my response to that is that I suppose it's a question of emphasis, and with limited resources, what are you going to devote them to? And in my view, the emphasis on elections is a mistake. It's a strategic error. That the actual answer to for example, in the question of the abolitionist movement and slavery, the abolitionist movement is what was responsible for the abolition of slavery in the United States. It was not an electoral process, and in fact, the abolitionist movement was characterized by militant organization throughout the United States, even in the South. And sure, there was an electoral component, and I'm not opposing elections per se in some sort of abstract sense, but this notion that the only political voice that workers have is through a party which has yet to come into being is wrong. The fact is that the whole thrust of political agitation and movements based on the working class has to be based on what the workers' power actually is. And that's not going to be an election. The election may express that in terms of legislation and changing the governmental structure. But if there's no mass base of people mobilized to fight, forget it. You're intrinsically going to be giving it over to someone. And the point is that that's not going to work anyway. In other words, even if you had a Labor Party or a workers' party that actually represented the working class, that alone is not going to work either. You still have to have the workers mobilized themselves in their communities and their workplaces, not only on the job, but throughout the whole society, to actually exert political pressure and force, actual force. You see, that's going to actually change the conditions and not just protest. That's the difference.
Matt Huber, jump in on that one, and then we'll come to Bob.
Yeah, I would just sort of agree that I think this it's obviously not either elections or the streets and labor organizing. I think you're going to have to do both. I think we have to prioritize building back the labor movement and labor organization in that capacity to exact punishment on the capitalist class, as Matt said. But I do think, unfortunately, we live in a society where most people experience politics and think about politics through the electoral realm. So I do think if we were to have a working class party or working class organization, they have to intervene in that realm and be present and fight for certain demands and programs in the electoral realm. But I think ultimately the real power does come from that. The labor's capacity to strike and do things like that.
Okay.
Can I add one small thing?
Okay, sure, Matt.
I want to add one more thing. I'm not opposed to what Howie's saying. I want to be clear about that. It's just that, as I said, it's a matter of emphasis. And you see this not only in terms of work and community, but you also see it in terms of war. Because who gets recruited for war? Who is going to go and fight and die? And this is what we're dealing with here. And I think that organizing in the army or in the armed services is also important. And this is where it's going to be. It's happening now. So we have to keep this, focused on where actual workers are and what their role is in society.
Okay, Bob, go for it.
Okay, yeah, a couple of points. I was struck by somebody saying that working people voted for Trump because they hate the Democrats, that they see them as traitors and they see them as representatives of the elite. That strikes me as being true, and it made me think about the Brexit vote here in the UK, where people thought they were voting against the elite and kind of giving them a kick up the seat of the pants. So I think there is an important point there that people do hate traditionally working class parties or left wing parties, and we have to do something about that. The other point I wanted to pick up was what I think Matt Callahan said about, is America a democracy? Personally, I don't believe it's a democracy, and I don't believe the United Kingdom is a democracy. So I think there has to be in the left has to present itself in working class communities and other places as the voice of democracy, and there's an educational process there about, but what is democracy and why are the current systems not actually democracy? I think that's something that we can do. We can do that kind of, arguing in the bus stop with somebody, or we can do it through some sort of educational process presented by the left. And I wonder so I'm curious to what the American comrades think about that.
Yes, answer the question 30 seconds. Is America a democracy? Howie.
Well, I would say it's a semi-democracy. There are definitely, democratic aspects, votes. I think the best thing we got is the Bill of Rights. We have democratic rights. On the other hand, our electoral system, winner take all, tends toward a two-party system that the capitalists control. And we have non-majoritarian institutions like the Senate, 2 votes per state, not 1 vote per person or proportional per person. Same with the Electoral College and presidential races. So it's a mixed bag. We also don't have, and I would argue that this is something the left should build at the local level, is popular assemblies. Take the New England town meeting tradition and go national with it and insist that neighborhoods or the districts of city councils have assemblies, face-to-face democracy that can hold their representatives to the council accountable. So you really have a popular grassroots democracy and bring people directly into the political process.
Okay, Howie. We're going to get, I hope, to foreign affairs as well. The war in Ukraine, Gaza, these are important things. But Matt Huber, is America a democracy?
Yeah, I would agree with semi-democracy. I mean, the Electoral College, the Senate are just basically anti-democratic institutions. But I do think we have to take seriously that there was you can count up the popular vote. Everyone voted. And Trump won that vote. And I think we have to be, if we're talking a lot today about working class power and reconnecting with the working class, Trump saw huge gains with the working class. For the first time, he won. There was a 17-point swing in those that make between 50,000 and 100,000. And he won that category for the first time. And he also won under 50,000 with an 11-point swing, and he won that by 1 point. So there's a massive realignment going on. The working class, particularly people without college educations, are shifting in droves, not just in the United States, but in much of the industrialized world. They're shifting to the right, and they're finding in the right a kind of anti-establishment politics that speaks to them. And so this is a real disaster for any kind of left formation if we're increasingly finding our base in educated and affluent, often suburban type of voters, and we need to figure out how to get back to the working class because we're losing them.
Okay, Matt Callahan, is America a democracy?
No, it's an oligarchy. It's an oligarchy, and in the classic Aristotelian terms, it is an oligarchy. It is, if you read the original descriptions from Greek philosophers, it is not a democracy; it's an oligarchy, and at the same time, I actually agree with Howie's idea of the public assemblies and the fact that we need to find ways on a very local level to gather the public to actually discuss and debate policy, but then they have to have a mechanism for enforcing their decisions. I live in Switzerland, which is formally more democratic, and you have exactly the same problem there, which is you have multi-parties, you have all the things that Howie was talking about. You actually have referenda that matter in terms of, the Constitution is actually written by the people and so on. But it's still a problem of how do you enforce it? When the referendums are passed, the government still has to implement them, and they don't.
Right.
You know, I don't want to get into a long thing. I can prove it if you want to, if you dispute. But the fact is that there have been numerous very progressive legislative initiatives that passed in Switzerland that were not implemented by the government. This is notorious. It's a scandal. But it's again, this you can even improve the formal aspects of democracy, but unless those popular assemblies that Howie's talking about actually have the power to carry out the policies that they're advocating, then forget it.
Okay, let's go. D. Searle.
Great. Thanks, Alan. First of all, apologies. I have a thumping COVID headache, so I'll probably be even less coherent than I normally am. My question is really how we build or rebuild a left political culture. To try and reclaim those tribes. We've lost the tribes. It seems that when people vote for a progressive government, even though most governments are not truly progressive, they're doing it because people like me are doing it. They're out there. So yeah, it's certainly workplace stuff that you're mentioning, but it's also the stuff on the streets. It's the things in the communities. It's regular things. They can be quite small things. Like in the UK, we have miners' galas, things that are based around workplaces, things that where you have protests, but actually things that are also a celebration, whether it's May Day or something else. We have lost a lot of that. And meanwhile, there's been a concentration of power into fewer and fewer hands, and that's economic power and political power, and they are hand in hand. Now, the weakness of our representative political systems around the world is that they're kind of based on a sleight of hand. They always are. People promise a lot while they're there getting elected. Then once they're in power, they only really deliver enough that can get them to the next election. It's never really about changing a country for the better. And a lot of that depends on that pressure that's going to come from below. Now, a lot of those tribes, those voting tribes were based on a kind of self-interest, because it could well be that in working class communities, certainly talking about the UK, and I'm sure to a certain extent that's true in the States, they would vote for politicians that they thought would help their communities. But there happened to be a kind of solidarity about that because they were the many. Now, that stuff about voting in self-interest has become amplified because it's become so much more individualized, and it's also against the other, whether that's immigrants or others, rather than for each other. So my question is how, in a time when power is concentrated in fewer hands and where we just don't do things together because of the way that the online world atomizes us, how can we rebuild a kind of political culture that can help us build that groundswell, so that when it either comes, whether it's localized decisions or national decisions, you've got enough other people like me that want to vote for a progressive way, and for many of us here that would include trying to save the planet as well as the very immediate things about improving my standard of living.
Okay, great question. We're going to now sort of switch into cultural questions. How do we build this movement? There's voting and all that kind of stuff. How do we get this kind of and it's celebration? When we get victories, how do we sort of get this sense of collectivity? Howie, what about you? What do you think?
Well, you need a party. We need a party that's not just electoral, but understands that we have to rebuild institutions where people can congregate, whether it's, sports leagues. I mean, socialist parties used to organize that, or the socialist newspaper would have all the sports scores. So people would get that paper because they really covered it well. Milwaukee socialists used to do that. You're right about the atomization, and that is replacing working class culture. It's a commercial culture. It's a consumerist culture. So that's one thing. The labor movement. I mean, I'm a veteran of Teamsters for a Democratic Union. And I don't want to go into a whole critique there, but that is where we need a political party that's in the Labor Notes Network and in the UAW for Democracy, UAWD, the Reform Caucus. I know a lot of people in that caucus. It's very weak at the grassroots in the movement. The old administrative caucus is still the real power at the base. You need a political party with that as its conscious direction and organizes around that. Same thing, I think Matt's point about the military. I had experience with that. I was drafted for Vietnam. So I joined the GI movement, Vietnam Vets Against the War, American Servicemen's Union. And that's important because if push comes to shove, you can't have the military united against you. And so I think that's why we need a party. I think maybe we agree. We need a party that's engaged in movement activity as well as electoral activity. But without that party, the cultural stuff won't be done on our terms. And the stuff in the labor movement, I've always said we won't get a labor party until the left party is getting over. Well, let me put it this way. The old leaders, we had a labor party that Tony Mazzocchi and them tried to start. And the holders of the franchise say, we'll start it again when 10% of the unions are ready to start it. And I've been telling them, the unions won't be ready to start it until 10% of the electorate is backing a left-wing party. And then the unions will say, okay, looks plausible. So anyway, we need a party it's a movement party.
Just before the two Matts jump in on that one, also, I look at the age of the people here, other than Holly. How do we get more younger people involved in this movement? Matt Huber, how about you? How are we going to build more of a culture of resistance?
Yeah, I agree. We got to learn from that history of parties that, they did sports leagues. They had, socialist glee clubs and dances and musical events. And they really, but it was for a different time where people lived in dense cities where they lived close to the factory and the union hall and the party hall. And these were easier. So unfortunately, I think we're going to have to do more. We are going to do stuff like this online, using online tools to bring people together. But you gotta, I think, I had been spending a lot of time organizing with the Democratic Socialists of America, and they did attract a ton of young people. But I think sometimes the organizing can be quite dull. And just getting through the business and the sort of the nuts and bolts of keeping an organization going, and there wasn't enough of the fun and the kind of social and cultural outlets that you're speaking to that can really keep people, I think, rooted in an organization. We got to learn from the past, but also innovate and think about new models and new modes of organization.
Right. Okay. Matt Callahan, who's a great musician, and he, for example, has performed at all kinds of events. He's done them here in the UK, and this kind of culture of resistance. Matt, what do you think?
Well, very quickly, I want to agree with both Howie and Matt. I do think we need a party and all those things, so I won't repeat that. But I also want to add that we need to actually actively engage on any scale. In other words, it's not a question of quantity, it's a question of quality, using music, using other art forms to bring people together physically. And so that in itself is a very important thing, which takes a lot of effort, but it's worth the effort. And in the process of doing that, we have to get rid of this notion of celebrity culture and of the stars. This is not what it's about. This is one of the lousy products of the 60s, where, a star would support the anti-Vietnam War movement or whatever, and that would bring the people to the demonstration, or that would be their endorsement, the celebrity endorsement of some rock star would make the movement. That's not happening, man. That doesn't work. It's a disaster. And what we need is people to participate, join in making music, making art, making various other forms of expression, sharing that in their communities. We need to go to churches. We need to go to places where people actually congregate and participate in what people themselves are doing and bring this to them, meaning that's what I try to do, and that's what I encourage other musicians to do. And it does mean a certain amount of sacrifice, if you want to call it that. You're not necessarily going to have a career in the music business or in the bourgeois world of their culture. Yeah, you might have to give that up. You might have to sacrifice that for the future of humanity. But in the process, you're going to establish a real connection with real human beings who are fighting to be free. And that to me is what this is about, is like getting out of this whole celebrity culture, this whole dominance of the big, the spectacle, the whole, this whole thing, and getting down to the level of actually making music and sharing it with other people.
Okay, here comes Glenn. Glenn, go for it. Oh, turn yourself on.
I was just wondering, we've been reading about Project 2025, which is a pretty unpleasant document. We've also been reading, well, we're listening to Trump saying this is going to be the last election. Are those two things actually connected? Trump has not recanted on the fact that this is going to be the last election. Do we take that seriously? I'm always of the mind that if someone is a fascist and they say something, you take them seriously on that. Also, is that the opportunity as Project 2025 unfolds, and perhaps Trump's not forgetting he's got the Supreme Court on his side, is that the time that revolution, call it if you want to call it that, is most likely to happen?
Could somebody give us 30 seconds on what Project 2025 is? I've got a document here, but anybody? Matt, could you give us 30 seconds of what Project 2025 is? This was
Matt Huber.
Pardon?
I mean, as far as I know, it's organized by the Heritage Foundation, which used to be, I think, a more of a classic sort of free market libertarian type think tank, and they've kind of shifted in the more Trumpist economic direction. But in any case, I have not read it, but I've heard it's extremely reactionary, basically attempt to completely dismantle the administrative state of the United States, get rid of all regulation, and gut any sort of social safety net that we have left, which is not much. And so it's a very dangerous document. And I would say right now, it's very clear that the Senate is in the hands of the Republicans. It's not entirely clear that they have the House of Representatives. If they get the House, which actually, if you're betting, seems likely, if they get the trifecta, then I think there's a real danger of Project 2025 or versions of it coming to fruition.
Right. Howie, what do you think? Is Project 2025? Can we also sort of get into, is there actually going to be the deportation of 10 million people? I mean, are these things, what are the chances of these incredibly reactionary policies coming in, the attacks on immigrants? There's a clear, in this country and in the United States, a racist base to the culture. Is this sort of likely to happen? Matt Callahan?
Well, I honestly can't say. I suspect there's a deep contradiction, because actually the capitalist class needs the immigrants. And that's certainly been true in where I'm from, California, which has always relied on immigrant labor and still does for the food supply of the United States. So it's a contradiction between, a populist notion that Trump was able to play on and what the actual needs are of the economy. So I'm not sure exactly certainly the government is capable of doing such terrible things. Under Franklin Roosevelt, for example, they established Manzanar and a number of other camps to house Japanese Americans during World War II. It is certainly within the realm of possibility that the United States government will do that. But whether or not they will, and how they're going to replace those people whom they need to do their labor, I don't know.
Matt Huber.
I think Trump says a lot of things and doesn't always follow through. He didn't even build the wall. So let's point that out. And when he said he said you're not going to have to vote again. And he was speaking to a particular demographic, if I recall, I think the evangelicals or something. So he's like word vomit just comes out, and you can't take him seriously. That said, I think he does, again, if he has both houses of Congress, he has a bunch of really nasty people around him. And I think they're more, his party now is his party, whereas when he came into power in 2017, the Republicans were somewhat divided against him. So I do fear they're going to try to do some serious deportation regime that's going to be awful. And again, we're going to have to be on the defensive, really trying to organize for mutual aid and defense of these communities. So I think it's a real danger. But I also think there's probably going to be another election in 2028.
Howie, go for it. And then we're going to come to Richard Harris. We're just sort of coming up to about an hour. I don't see us going on too much longer. Howie, how dangerous? I mean, what is, you can't predict this, Matt can't, but and we obviously have to be vigilant about these kinds of reactionary things. How likely do you think they're going to happen? Is there going to be, for example, a real mass movement? It's going to sort of backfire.
I think the difference this time is that Trump didn't expect to win in 2016. He didn't have people in place. Project 2025, it's not just the 900 pages of policy wonk stuff. It's the thousands of people they've recruited. They plan to purge the civil service and put hacks for Trump in there. And so among those people are just the most vicious racists, like Stephen Miller. I mean, we know he's racist in the Green Party because one of our, important people in California is a Latino woman that went to high school with him. The guy is just he just hates Latinos. And he's going to be in charge of immigration. And there are people that's the motivating for not just the cadre to go into the government, but all these militia groups, who have from time to time tried to enforce directly on the border. So I think, yeah, they're going to try it, even though employers don't like it. But what we've seen is a lot of the big capitalists, the Elon Musks and Jeff Bezoses, they are kowtowing to Trump because they're afraid if he's got state power, he can go after them too. So I think the only check we've got left, if they do get the House, is the cloture vote, the filibuster in the Senate, because there are enough Democrats there. So instead of passing legislation, they're going to have to do it through the executive branch. And they won't hesitate to do it. And of course, they'll be sued, and some of them may get slowed up in the courts, but the courts have been populated with reactionaries by Republican appointees. In fact, I think there's a backlog in Biden appointees that the Republicans won't approve. So they've really filled the courts, and the courts are going to back up this reactionary stuff to a large degree. So,
okay.
Cloture, I was opposed to it when the Democrats could have done some good stuff with it, like get the Voting Rights Act restored.
Right.
But now it may be the last guardrail we've got.
We're going to ask our last question from Richard Harris, my mate down in Somerset. Can you leave us on an up note, Richard? Is that possible?
Yes, I'd be very grateful if our guests could help me understand exactly what has happened in this election. We know that Trump got more than 50% of the vote, and he won. He didn't win in 2020. So he got less than 50% then. So there's been some vote moving. So who are the people who moved? If I look at Deutsche Welt, the German newspaper, on their English language site, published a statistical breakdown of how different demographics voted in the election based upon surveys conducted by Associated Press at the time of voting, obviously talking to voters when they exited the voting booth. And the data shows this is very, very strange. In Britain, in the United Kingdom, the oldest people, they're the most conservative people, and the youngest people are the least conservative people. And there's a very, very clear move towards conservatism with age that's traceable through the age bands. But when I look at the figures for the US presidential election, I see that amongst 65-year-olds plus, the number of men and number of women who voted for Trump in 2020 and 2024 is almost exactly the same. There's no movement at all. So who are the people who moved? And to me, it's stark. It's really quite surprising. In 2020, we have 36% of the voting population voting for Trump. And then in the election that's just been held, it's 46%. That's an increase of that of the vote in that age range of almost a third. And that third has come from the Democrat vote. Perhaps even more surprising to me is given the issues around Roe and Wade and so on in the United States, is the young women vote. And again, in 2020, we have 37% of women under 45 voting Trump. But in 2024, we have 43% of women under 45 voting for Trump. Again, quite a noticeable increase in a population you'd think would actually slide the other way. I would have thought that they might slide the other way, given they had a choice with a female Democrat and what Trump has been saying about women and abortion. So
Okay, Richard. So this idea about young people's vote, I mean, in recent German elections, as Matt will know about, young voters were quite lined up behind neo-fascist party in Germany. So what about young people? Howie?
Well, I think the general trend in the United States has been the younger people, like was described, the younger people are more progressive than the older people in general. And I haven't seen the numbers, but I've heard people say what was just reported, that the under 25, particularly young males, voted for Trump much more than they did in 2020. But I think to the general question, who are the people that moved? They were Democrats who abstained. They moved, they didn't vote. Because as I understand the totals, Trump has about the same total he had in 2020. The Democratic total is about 10 million less. So, there's so much moved to Trump as they moved back to the couch and said, to hell with both of them.
Right.
I think that was the big move. So that's my sense.
Okay.
I haven't gone through the
Huber?
numbers closely, but that's what I get.
Any good words about American young people? You, like, obviously as a teacher, you see lots of young people in your classroom, maybe not completely the average student, but tell us, what about the American young people?
Yeah, I saw the numbers today. I wish I could remember them exactly, but I think it was something like in 2020, Biden won young males by about 15 points, and then this round, Trump won them by about 5 points. So it was something like a 20+ point swing to Trump amongst young males. So again, particularly out of COVID, I see a lot of young males who are seemingly very alienated and angry. And I think that's what we're starting to see. And as you said, that's the case in Germany. But I think it's important to point out that Trump made gains basically across all races and all age categories and all, because he really had this sort of across the board win. But I think the most alarming things again are the fact that he's gaining significantly amongst working class, low income people, African American men in particular. At least if we can trust the exit polls, he made significant gains among them. And of course, a really massive gain in relation to 2020 amongst Latino populations. So he's really burrowing into the multiracial working class. A lot of people think it's, just the white working class that Trump is winning over, but he's starting to win over really the whole swath, particularly of non-college educated working class people who are tired and being punished by an unequal neoliberal system and are angry, and they're looking to channel that anger into a kind of anti-establishment populist candidate. Right. And that's Trump in this cycle, at least.
Okay, a last intervention by Matt Callahan.
Well, I can only comment in a sort of a general sense. I think that a bankruptcy of identity politics is one big part of it for young people, the young people I'm playing for. and responding to in a concert or public situation. I think people have had it with that, and there's a lot of confusion. It's not as though they go from identity politics to working class politics or revolutionary politics, but they're seeing through the put a black face in a high place and everything will be fine, or put a woman in power and everything will be fine, and all that stuff. I mean, we've had decades now of women and people of color being elected to positions, and it doesn't change anything for the great majority. So I think a lot of people are reacting to that. I'm speaking again more about the young people question, and I also think that in particular, the Palestine issue is major amongst young people, and the fact that this genocide is going on, and that the United States has sponsored it, maintained it, continued it as a policy representing them as American youth. And not to mention the fact that in class terms, most, it's going to be the working people who have to go fight when the next war starts. And I think that those things have added up cumulatively and are being expressed in this election. I do want to add one thing from the European situation, which kind of reinforces something that Howie said earlier, and that is that in Germany, everybody's talking about AfD, but the alternative for Deutschland. But in Germany, you have Sarah Wagenknecht, and you have an actual leftist, socialist, communist, whatever she calls herself, who's actually putting forward policies that reflect the interests of the working class, and is therefore actually winning. In a large segment of the population. Of course, that's not what's happening in the United States, and you don't have a multi-party system as you do in Germany. But nevertheless, if there is a real alternative, people are going to choose it. And I think the evidence for that was simply what happened with Bernie Sanders. I mean, when that everybody concedes that had the Democratic Party allowed Bernie Sanders to run, he would have defeated Trump in the first place. And I think that the point is, once again, it is actually interesting that it reflects some kind of development of political consciousness. It may not be clear and it may not be well focused, but it's no longer just accepting, what do you want to call it? Pork barrel politics, or you do something for me and I'll vote for you, or, that it's becoming actually a question of how the country is governed.
Okay. Why don't we've been 70 minutes. I think we've covered the waterfront. And I've just really, really enjoyed it. Thanks to our people coming from United States, from London. You can make your session in time, Matt, and Howie over in Ukraine. And thank you very much for my mates here asking some, I thought, really great questions. And tell your friends this will be coming out on the YouTube channel of Left Lane Presents within hopefully not too many hours. So thanks a lot. And we have work to do in this country as well.